The Avalon Peninsula Campaign occurred during King William's War when forces of New France, led by Pierre Le Moyne d'Iberville and Governor Jacques-François de Monbeton de Brouillan, destroyed 23 English settlements along the coast of the Avalon Peninsula, Newfoundland in the span of 3 months. The campaign began with raiding Ferryland on November 10, 1696 and continued along the coast until they raided the village of Heart's Content. After the siege of Pemaquid, d'Iberville along with Father Jean Baudoin led a force of Canadians, Acadians, Pemaquid and Abanakis in the Avalon Peninsula Campaign. They destroyed almost every English settlement in Newfoundland. Over 100 English were killed, many times that number captured, and almost 500 deported to England or France. Historical context. During this time period, the only French settlement on Newfoundland was Plaisance. Prior to the arrival of d'Iberville, Newfoundland's French governor de Brouillan ordered a French naval squadron under Chevalier Nesmond to lay siege to St. John's in retaliation for earlier English attacks. In 1694, Nesmond set sail from Plaisance to lay siege St. John's. This siege was unsuccessful. 2 years later, however, the French made a second attempt. On September 12, 1696, Quebec's governor Frontenac sent Pierre Le Moyne d'Iberville to Newfoundland. The previous August, d'Iberville had just been victorious in the siege of Pemaquid, on the coast of present-day Maine. The campaign, the Newfoundland Campaign, involved a novel strategy, both a land and sea assault of the villages. D'Iberville attacked by land while Sieur de Brouillan attacked by sea. D'Iberville's strategy of attacking the settlement by land was the first recorded in Newfoundland and, as a result, the port villages were only prepared for an assault by sea. D'Iberville left Placentia on All Saints' Day with his detachment of 124 men, soldiers, Acadians, and Indians. It was an 80 kilometers, 9-day march across the Avalon Peninsula. Siege of Fairyland. On the morning of September 9, the residents of Fairyland awoke to a frightening sight. On the horizon, emerging from deep within a wall of fog, was a small armada of French men of war. When within range, the French began a bombardment of the settlement through continuous broadside cannon volleys. Sieur de Brouillan had begun the siege of Fairyland. D'Iberville arrived on November 10, and the troops sacked Fairyland. Meanwhile, the 110 people of Fairyland fled to Bay Bulls and set about fortifying it. Raid on Cape Royal. D'Iberville set out against Bay Bulls using the small boats he had taken in Fairyland. On his way, Cape Royal was captured on November 12. Raid on Bay Bulls. He then captured Bay Bulls on November 24, including a 100-ton merchant ship. Raid on Petty Harbor. On November 24, after a 3-hour march from Bay Bulls, d'Iberville met up with his group of 20 scouts who had been sent to study the approaches to St. John's. 2 days later, he encountered a detachment of 30 English soldiers posted on a hilltop near Petty Harbor. On November 26, d'Iberville charged and the enemy surrendered immediately. D'Iberville and his men were in command of the small port just 8 kilometers south of St. John's. However, some colonists from Petty Harbor escaped to St. John's, where they alerted its residents. Siege of St. John's. As d'Iberville marched into St. John's from Petty Harbor, English residents marched at the Waterford Valley to meet and repel the French. A pitched battle occurred in the Waterford Valley and on the heights of Kilbride. Of the 88 English defenders, 34 died in the battle. The English broke ranks and hastily retreated to St. John's. As d'Iberville approached St. John's, the English settlers scattered. Many sailed away, others escaped to the forests. A number of settlers and soldiers took refuge in Fort William. For 3 days the French laid siege to Fort William. On November 30, the English commander, Governor Miners, surrendered on condition that the English be allowed to leave St. John's. 230 men, women and children were sent off in a ship and duly arrived in Dartmouth, England. However, a further 80 refugees were drowned when the ship foundered off the coast of Spain. After destroying St. John's, the French marched on to Bay and Portugal Cove. Internal struggles between de Brouillan and d'Iberville over the spoils of war followed. On December 25, de Brouillan left for Plaisance. The French burnt 80 shallops in the harbour. Raid on Conception Bay. The villages on Conception Bay were the next targets. Holyrood was first, followed by Harbour Main and Port de Grave. Battle of Carbonear. On January 24, 1697, 200 permanent residents of Carbonear withdrew to Carbonear Island and successfully fended off the French and Indian attack on January 31. D'Iberville had only 70 men. The rest were dispersed in local skirmishes, holding villages and prisoners. Leaving Carbonear, d'Iberville then attacked Old Pelican, Bay de Verde, Hants Harbour, New Pelican and Heart's Content. In many cases the local fishermen had fled to Carbonear. There was an unsuccessful attempt at a prisoner exchange. Frustrated, d'Iberville then sacked Brigus and Port de Grave. Carbonear Island continued to hold out, but d'Iberville torched their evacuated settlement on February 28 before leaving. D'Iberville then headed to Heart's Content before walking in a small group across the Avalon Peninsula Isthmus. He arrived March 4 at Plaisance. D'Iberville then picked up his spoils of war, his scattered troops and approximately 200 prisoners at Bayboul. French attacks by sea on the remnants of the settlements continued into the spring. Aftermath. D'Iberville never returned to Newfoundland. These raids devastated the English settlements of Newfoundland. Every English settlement in Newfoundland had been destroyed and the English colony had been depopulated, except for Bonavista, which d'Iberville did not reach, and the island holdout at Carbonear. Estimates of 80% of the families were killed, deserted the village, were taken prisoner or were deported. However, the English were able to recapture the Newfoundland territory in summer of 1697 with a strong relief force of 1,500 troops. They found St. John's and all the English harbours on the Avalon abandoned, pillaged and every building destroyed. The English slowly began to rebuild and resettle. As a result of the campaign, the English government created permanent defences for Newfoundland. Previously the English had not built permanent fortifications or garrisons in Newfoundland as it was regarded as a seasonal fishing base. However, d'Iberville's devastating campaign had demonstrated the threat to the poorly defended colony. The following year, construction began on professionally engineered fortifications at Fort William. D'Iberville continued his battles with the English, with the Battle of Hudson's Bay.